Okay, everybody, if you could have your seats. Before we start the next talk, and some of you may have heard this as you came in, just another public service announcement. Unfortunately, at 11:40 in Derwent 3, we did have down that John Christensen would be doing a talk on Roundup, more than a bug tracker. Unfortunately, he is no longer available, and his talk has been replaced. Russell Keith Magee will be presenting No Bad Pony on the Django web framework. So that's 11:40 in Derwent 3. The online schedule has been updated to reflect this. Back on to topic. So Roger Barnes is a programmer with more than 12 years experience, and he has joined the Python community in the last 3. And he's currently with tech startup Ariba as co-founder and CTO. Before that, he was technical lead developing Java enterprise applications, but today he's going to talk about continuous deployment with Django. So please give a warm welcome to Roger.
Hello. Hey. Hi, everyone. Yes, we're going to talk today about continuous deployment with Django, and I think it's one of people's favorite bugbears when they're doing any web development. So I'm going to do sort of a 50,000-foot view of this sort of thing and do a couple of Python dive bombs into some specific things along the way. I know there's a lot of different ways you can do this. This is my story. You're welcome to disagree. You can disagree at me if you want. Or we can have a talk after this. I'll be around tomorrow for a bit as well if you want to discuss this in further detail. So a little bit about me. As mentioned, I am now the co-founder and CTO at Ariba. We're a fairly new startup, and this particular talk is a case study of applying continuous deployment to that. But in the past, I have worked in a much more established environment where the aspects of this continuous deployment has sort of evolved, and I've sort of cut my teeth on that over the last 12 years. So yeah, about 3 years of Python, 12 years web development, but I also have other interests, so if you like frisbee, photography, beer or adventure, you'll get along just fine with me too. In particular, I've got some Tassie photos throughout these slides in case the tech gets too heavy. So there's a lot of other talks, and I'm loving every talk that's come to this point. For me, I'm just trying to glue together a lot of the details that everyone else has already covered about testing and cloud deployments and all that sort of stuff. So that makes it really good. So let's just get some definitions out of the way. We talk about continuous delivery, continuous deployment. There is a semantic argument there. For these purposes, I'm going to say they're the same thing. Getting the rapid, incremental, low-risk delivery of high-quality, valuable, new functionality to users through automation of the build, testing, and deployment process. We all just won buzzword bingo. So it's basically deploying every good version of your software or being able to when and if you want to. And Etsy, who do this stuff really well, although with PHP, talk about it as the mean time to bad idea detection, or reducing that rather. And it's more than being about technology. There's certainly tools for automation, but it does take a certain mindset and discipline. People who are cross-functional and small sort of startup teams tend to be better at this sort of thing. Not everything is something you want to continuously deploy. There's also some amount of process and convention that you usually want to have in place. And this stuff is flexible and you can rewire it a lot of different ways. Why do continuous deployment? I hope that question isn't too unanswered for people. It goes back to Mark Ram's sort of keynote about failing fast, winning fast, or not failing at all, ideally. Finding out quickly, rapid feedback from real users of real use of your software. Things like real-time control, not writing software that people turn out not to want 6 months down the track. All those sorts of things are really good. So in practice, what this means is having a single path to production, optimizing for resilience. There's a catchphrase in the continuous delivery, continuous deployment world about if it hurts, do it more often. So if your deployment is every 2 months and it takes you 2 weeks, make that smaller, faster, more often until it doesn't hurt anymore. And doing this, it does become natural over time, and the return on investment actually delivers, even in a single-person startup, or single-tech startup. And as I said, there's lots of ways to do this, but here's what I've done. So, quick adventure. I like visual stuff. Hopefully, I can fill in some of the gaps along the way. So we're in a development environment, and we are writing code as normal. And instead of running a local tech stack, a development sort of stack, we actually, where my slides work, excuse me, we go to our a virtualized environment which is running as close to a production system as possible. From there, once we've got our code written and tested, we'll talk more about testing, we will commit it to a source control repository, standard best practice. That commit onto mainline by any developer will trigger a build process of some sort. And this is where you can get into all kinds of different ways of doing it. I'll show you what I've got, which is somewhat early stage. You can get a lot more complicated, and maybe you want to, maybe you don't. But first what we're going to do is we're going to run all of our unit tests, do some static analysis and coverage. Tests that run really quickly, get back to you in a few seconds, and ideally they should always pass because your developers have already run the same tests in their development environments. If and only if that passes, we go into the functional testing stage. We can run another suite of tests. They're a bit more complicated. And again, you have to pass these before you get to the next stage. We're now going to deploy that code into a staging environment. We're going to test our data migration against a production copy of the code. We might do some basic smoke tests, UI tests, and effectively you have a QA environment that can be used for validation before you actually go to production. And again, this is a virtualized environment. It might not be local, it could be in the cloud, whatever that is, sometime. Finally, if and only if that passes, you can push the deploy button. And so in this case, I'm using Fabric underneath the covers, which we'll dig into, and simply run fab deploy, which does lots of things, which we'll look at. That goes to your production environment, which is also configured in the same way. And you have happy users on your website, hopefully. Those users produce data, and as does your system. So at this point, you need to measure, analyze, monitor, all those sorts of things. I'll go through some of the tools. Graham's already mentioned quite a few of these, which is good. If you want more details, you can look up a lot of them. I recommend all of them. I'm actually using all of them. I would like to consolidate, but I haven't done that yet. And then finally, you can learn from that information and feed back into your loop. So that's basically the big picture that we're looking at. And I've mentioned things like Vagrant and Fabric and Django, and I'm going to try and sort of put those pieces together. And you may have recognized Jenkins in there as well. So I've already harped on this quite a bit. Make your environments all look the same if you can. This avoids surprises when you go to production. That means don't use run server in your development stack if you're using Nginx in production, and certainly don't use run server in production. To do that, I'm using something called Vagrant, and hopefully I won't get lynched for using a Ruby-based solution here. Basically, it provisions Oracle's VirtualBox virtualized environments, and it will let you provision them and spin them up from scratch, and then if you want, you can throw it away and spin up another one. And it does nice things like sharing folders and like with your development environment and opening ports and things like that for you. So it's really nice and simple to use. And once you have it, you have a self-service development environment that other people can just pick up and use as well. This is just what a Vagrant file looks like. It defines your base image, your provisioning. In my case, I'm using Puppet, and I'm using the same Puppet config throughout, which we'll see. Port forwarding, folder sharing, and so on. So the key takeaway here is having a repeatable version configuration. You might not want to use Puppet or Chef. You can use things like build out. If you want, you can write this in Fabric or in shell scripts. It's depending on how complicated you want to get. And there's this concept of Snowflake servers and Phoenix servers. A Snowflake server is this fragile thing, and every one of them is unique because you've gone in and you've hand-tooled it and you've customized that. And you can't make another one without either writing a wiki page about how to do that or being lucky. So a Phoenix server is one where you can start from a base operating system image and get to a working state repeatably. And that's what we're trying to do here. It's not always an easy goal to get to, but it's worth getting at least as close as you can. So again, I use Puppet to do that in this case, and that's provisioning the OS level and the services layer. For the actual scripted tasks that I use in development or in staging or in production, there's lots of little fragments in a Fabric file. Is everyone familiar with Fabric? Good. I discovered it a couple of years back, and it's really good. So the anti-pattern here is if you can't spin up your environment with one command and you have to do some hand tooling, then you're not quite there yet. This is just an example of what my Puppet config looks like. It includes a whole bunch of things, and the production environment has almost exactly the same set of includes. There's a couple of extra bits and pieces there. So we've got Fabric, and we've got a bunch of commands in there that are repeatable that we want to run. We then need to think about, well, how do I run them against Vagrant and against my staging production environments and so on? Basically, you can rewire the environment for your Fabric. I will put the slides online, so feel free to just glaze over here. It will read out of your Vagrant configuration the SSH details so that you can connect to your Vagrant instance and run Fabric files, commands against it, rather. Dependencies, I won't harp on this. I think we all know this as well. Virtual env and pip, using requirements files, all that sort of thing, that you make all your configuration as code. There's some couple of gotchas in there, things like using explicit versions. I have a disagreeer, okay, we'll talk. If you are using GitHub repositories, or even if you're not, make sure you try at least choose a version and don't just accidentally deploy someone's new version of the library you want to use into production and find that the setup.py file's broken. So how we do that with Fabric is I've got a VE run command which wraps the regular Fabric run command to make whatever command you want to run happen within the confines of that virtual environment. So now when we run pip install, we use VE run pip install and we get our requirements. Database migration, has everyone heard of South? Yes, mostly. Has anyone not? Well worth looking up. It's really good for database migration. I haven't come across an alternative that seems to be pushing at the competitive level that I would expect, so this is what I'm working with. It's good for schema migrations and for data migrations, so you might be adding columns but also pushing data around within your tables. It's worth figuring out how to do that so that when you need to, you can. The important point here with deployment is don't put your expansion operations and contraction operations, as in adding and removing columns, together. If you do that, you have a lot of trouble should you happen to need to roll back. So ideally, if you want to add columns, do that, get it out there, migrate your data, and then when or if you decide that the old column is ready to be removed because you're happy that it's safe, then do that as a separate deployment. There's a certain amount of engineering input here that's important to that. So using South Fabric, very simple, standard manage command. You can either run the migrate commands directly or you can put -- migrate into syncdb. So tying all of that together, if you do want to run these commands against your Vagrant environment, fab, Vagrant, and then your other commands. No talk's complete without mentioning source control. I won't harp on too much. There's a couple of things that I do. I put tags into my builds that come from the continuous integration pipeline, so I know what has successfully built, what has successfully deployed, and I put all of this information into one repository. So I have my application layout. There's always various ways you can do this, but I have my Fabrics file in there. I have my pip requirements in there. I have my shell scripts for the build jobs, and I also have all the Vagrant and Puppet configuration in the same environment. Now there's a couple of caveats to whether that's a good idea. So far that's working for me pretty well. Next we get to automated testing. I'm using Django's test framework, and so far that's working well for me. It's pretty well established and does what I need. And to get that continuously integrated or continuously tested, I use Jenkins to do that. Now, there's a Django Jenkins plugin, or module rather, that will run your tests and produce Jenkins-friendly output, and you get all your nice pretty graphs about your test trends and so on. It also does things like PyLint, static analysis, coverage, that sort of thing as well. A little throwaway extra line there. I discovered Factory Boy last week. Instead of writing test fixtures in horrible markup languages, you can use Factory Boy to generate objects. That's a good one just to take away and have a look at. I found it to be really good, especially for unit testing. So test separation. At this point, you can just run all of your tests as a single suite in Jenkins and then deploy once it all passes. Now, if you want to get fancy or you have a much more complicated environment, you can split those tests up by type. It allows you to do certain things like parallelizing certain jobs. You can keep your runtimes low. You can do unit tests first. You can trigger some of your tests on a different schedule altogether. So you might have a suite of tests that do more the performance side of things that you run every night instead of on every commit. So different types of tests you might have. We've talked a bit about unit and functional tests. You've got staging tests. You can do smoke tests against your staging environment to prove that it's generally up and running and that the login page shows up, that sort of thing. And then if you've got certain tests that become flaky or slow, we want to be able to sort of mark those and not have to do a heavyweight, we don't want to have to delete the code or comment it out. If we can just annotate it and be able to run them in isolation, that's something that we want to do with test separation. The question is how to do this with Django. You could write a custom suite. A lot of these to me seem quite manual, and so this is an area I still have an unanswered question. You could write a custom test runner. You can use things like Nose, I believe, have an annotation plugin where you can give tests attributes and run only those tests with certain attributes. I've got something similar where I've written a pipeline tag decorator, which is kind of like the skip if decorator in unit tests that says, if you've said to run tests, the unit tests, then only run the ones that have them tagged as such. And there's a bit of a brain dump there of what that looks like. Basically, it's a bit of a hack, to be honest, and this is why I don't like it yet, but I'm showing you it anyway. It looks for the arguments to the command that you've run and basically makes sure that the test either does get included in the suite or gets thrown out if it doesn't match. So we've already had a quick look at the build pipeline. It is about having one way to do it and having all developers feed into that one via the master branch of your source control system. There are some debates around on how to best do that. I don't think it's worth going into those right now. And it's basically about improving the policy of don't deploy broken code with a system where it's harder to do that because you've run through all your tests. It doesn't make your developers disciplined about writing them, but it at least will run the ones that are there. To that end, there's a build pipeline plugin in Jenkins, which is how we get those different jobs running in sequence. You basically configure them and you say, when this one passes, run these downstream builds. You get along the way, and you can put in manual stops, which is what I've done with my deployment to say, I want to push the button when I'm happy to deploy at the end. So currently I have a simple linear flow. Even for my situation, this may be overkill. I could probably combine those first two test jobs and run them all together. But it's I want to sort of prove that this would work. You can see the third one there, I was having a bad day and staging broke, and so I didn't get a deploy button. The second one is, it did work and I could have pressed the deploy button, but I didn't. And then the first one at the top there, I did. Okay, so there's a Jenkins job, which basically runs the Jenkins pipeline command. I've just wrapped the regular Django Jenkins plugin with a little thing that manipulates the command line arguments. If anyone's interested in that, I'm happy to share it. But as I said, I haven't quite figured out if that's the best way to do things here. It works for now. Okay, so we've passed our unit tests, and we're now getting to the staging and QA aspect of our deployment pipeline. Basically, we now have a fabric command that runs a series of other fabric commands, very similar to the production deployment, except that it takes the code from the source repository, it pulls the database from production and runs the schema migrations, applies the Puppet config, so if that has changed, then it will update that Vagrant environment, installs any new requirements, and so on. So at this point, the staging server should have a deployed copy of your latest code. It should be working and running. You can point your QA team at it if you have one. Or if they want, they can spin up their own one and apply some commands themselves if they want to do something a bit more fancy. As a final check, there are some unit test-based smoke tests here that use Selenium and Django's unit test suite again to make sure that the site's up and running. You can check that the services are running, that the home page returns, the login works, all those sorts of things. And if that's all worked, then we tag that build as deployable in the source control repository. So now we're looking at deployment. I don't want to get into too much with this. I think this is more of a cloud architectural discussion, and there's nothing about how you do this that sort of really dictates how you will do your continuous deployment itself, except that you need to come up with some solution for deploying, which may involve a wholesale push out to your server or servers. You might have parallel environments where you have one live and one dark, which gets the new version, and then you switch it over, which is your kind of blue-green deployments. You might have a canary deployment where you have a cluster of servers, you take one out of the pool, update it, put it back in, and watch it for a little while before deciding to deploy all the other ones. And in extreme cases, I've heard of people actually building entire instances from scratch, which is really taking this sort of provisioning DevOps thing to the extreme and deploying an entire new virtual machine, switching over your load balancers and keeping the other one on standby until you're sure that you don't need it anymore. It's an interesting idea. I think it's pretty heavyweight, but it's an option. So deploying with Jenkins and Fabric, I've talked about those tags. Basically, when the staging job runs successfully, it applies a tag, and then my Fabric script looks for the latest version or the latest tag that's marked as successful, and that's what gets run in production using git reset. I need to parameterize this at some point, so you can say, actually, I want a different version, but this is the standard default at the moment. Am I going too fast? This is... Nope, okay, good. So here's just a picture of that. You can see that there's different tags, and you can see that the last deployed version was the second last one. Okay, 5 minutes, I think we're good. Deployment, basically, that's the last line that we want here is fab deploy. The rest sets up a virtual environment from within the Jenkins staging area and runs fab deploy. And that does a lot of things. Now, this is where my particular situation is quite simple. If you've got clusters and other things, this is where it can get more complicated, and I don't have a direct answer for that because it's going to depend on your situation. But I do things like taking a snapshot of the database. There's a module called Django DB Backup, which does a good job of that at the moment. Basically, it runs a MySQL or Postgres dump, and it can put it into a Dropbox if you want, or somewhere else. I'm just experimenting with that at the moment, but it seems to be good. We then run that pull, which also grabs a list of the changes that went into Git. We apply the Puppet changes. We update the requirements from pip. There's a Django extensions command that just wipes out any old PYC compiled Python files that potentially can trip you over. We then do the data migration. We collect our static resources, which may go to all sorts of places that you've configured. Behind all of these is usually a one-liner, but occasionally there's a couple of bits and pieces that happen. We reload our app server, bounce the task server, because I've got one, and I then tag the builders deployed at this point, and email myself a list of the changes. Just a quick note about decoupling deployment and release. A lot of the concepts here may sound like you're going to limit yourself or you have to hold changes out of your master branch. And there's quite a bit of discussion about it, but a lot of the solutions suggest that you can have the idea of feature flags. So you will wrap new functionality that isn't necessarily ready or you don't want everyone to have yet with a feature check. In Django in particular, there's a system called Gargoyle, which I think the Discus guys produced. Basically, you can wrap code with, if the switch is on, then do this in your code, and then you have an admin interface where, having deployed the code already, you can control when and if you switch it on, and even for who. So you can say it's only for staff, or 10% of users, or some other combination. So this is a good way to do a dark release of a new feature and decide when to actually enable it or how much to enable it. And it does feed into that whole fast feedback thing. You can try it for 50% of your users and you've got an A/B test. There's also Django Waffle, which I haven't used, but apparently is quite similar. So measurement is important here. We've tested everything, but we don't know how well it's behaving. This is where you have all these post-deployment checks that you can do. You can check error logs, you can check performance. There's behavior heuristics. Some people automate this quite heavily with things like check the number of 500 errors and make sure that, you know, they're not happening when they weren't before. There's several good examples, or several good options available here. I'm actually using all of these for different reasons. For tracking errors, Sentry is really good. Instead of getting emails when an error occurs, it goes into Sentry, and Sentry will send you one email, and if you have 999 other errors that are the same, you won't get 999 more emails. You can also mark when it's fixed, and it can tell you if you lied and it was still broken and it happened again. Lots of good stuff like that. You get stack traces, frequencies. All of this is coming out of your production environment. Sentry itself is a Django project. You just sort of run it along the side and it'll send error messages into it. Mewn, there's similar tools like it, but this is good for your operating system level metrics. You can install it from a package on most systems and have it plotting things like your cached memory usage or Nginx requests per second. Lots of these things, you have to know what you're looking for. So if you're looking for failed logins, for example, you want to have a plot of that somehow. New Relic, it's certainly worth a mention. Graham's been certainly singing its praises, and I can agree. It does show you lots of good stuff. It certainly goes beyond what your standard metrics will, especially into the browser user performance thing. You might discover that your IE6 users aren't getting the performance they want, and so you just don't care. Yeah, but no, in all seriousness, it's really good for looking at things. And the free plan, even if you don't have lots of money for servers, is worth it. Finally, there's a thing called StatsD, which was produced by Etsy as well, and they have a basically this feeds into Graphite, which is another Django-based measurement and collection tool. You can feed it counters and timers and all sorts of cool stuff. This stuff gets really fine-grained, and you can count and profile all sorts of stuff. Rollback options, I'm going to skip forward a little bit. Basically, if you're engineering for this fast deployment, you hopefully will avoid any catastrophically difficult rollbacks. So you can engineer around it, or you can engineer for it by making sure that you have some rollbacks available. My deployment rollback strategy is like you have a car with no reverse gear. You can go backwards, but you have to get out and push. So you might want to be a more careful driver to avoid that possibility. Where to from here? There's some tips here if you want to just grab the slides off SlideShare later. These are just a summary of the tools available. I certainly am not finished on this journey. There's a lot that I can sort out, and certainly as a startup grows, it's going to have different needs as well. My favourite one though is I need to make the big red deploy button big and red. There's some resources there as well, and we're through to Q&A. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. I have a feeling there's going to be lots of questions.
Yeah.
I have a bunch as well, but I might leave them for after.
How much time do we have?
Yeah, we've got about 5 or 6 minutes, so if you make your questions quick and your answers quick.
Thanks, Roger. I'm really interested in getting the balance right strategy-wise when you're doing small teams and trying to put deployment processes in that aren't overkill at the start. Mm-hmm. And you mentioned with the Vagrant config, you can do things in Fabric or move to Puppet. Where do you see the line between just doing everything in Fabric and making the jump into Puppet?
That's a very good question. Puppet is good for very declarative type of things, whereas Fabric's good for saying, do this. And so in Fabric, if you want to do the declarative stuff, you might have to engineer more for install this if it's not there already and that sort of thing. I think you can fully provision using just Fabric. I didn't because I already knew a bit of Puppet from my previous job, and that kind of worked for me. But I'm conscious that you could move that line. Like my virtual env is built from Puppet at the moment, but really it's probably more of a Fabric job now that I think about it. So in terms of priorities, I think Puppet's sort of low down, and it's how you want to provision too. A lot of this is very opinionated, so yeah.
Other questions?
Just a fairly short one. I noticed on one of your very early slides you had a point saying avoid long-lived branches. Would you be able to justify that, or what do you mean?
Right. So if you do have long-lived branches, you have to test and integrate them more often, which if you're happy to take that on, you can. The philosophy behind continuous delivery tends to suggest you can wrap things in feature flags. I did gloss over that a bit quickly. There is a debate about it, and I'm a little bit on the fence. It does depend as well on the complexity of your environment. If you have a long-lived branch for a particular feature, it just means you might want to have to run 2 build pipelines, one that doesn't deploy, just so that you can be sure that you're not going to have an integration headache later.
Anybody else? Oh.
Thanks very much for the talk. I wanted to apologise for the facial expression that you saw.
No, more than welcome.
The reaction was to the sentiment that you were giving to make configuration executable. Mm-hmm. I couldn't disagree more. Configuration should be declarative and not executable. You shouldn't have to run any particular interpreter, language interpreter, to get your configuration. It should be language agnostic, and you should be able to just read it as a data file rather than running it through Python or whatever, because otherwise you're stuck with having to run Python even if what you're configuring is not Python, etc.
Are you saying that maybe Puppet's better there, or...? No,
because you said that Puppet's configuration is declarative, so that's fine. You don't have to run the configuration as a program.
Right, absolutely, and that's where I think the Puppet and Fabric barrier lies. And
whereas, for instance, Django's settings is an executable configuration, and I hate that.
Right, no, fair point.
Anybody else? Probably last question. Oh, Russell. You're getting later and later, mate.
I thought I answered your question already.
Let everyone else have a go. I completely see where you're coming from, and I completely agree with the ideal of development environment should reflect your production environment to as much as humanly possible. And you sort of said, don't use dev server as your development server effectively. Mm-hmm. And the way you were solving that is by launching up Vagrant and having effectively developing in as close as possible to an actual development box. There's a cost to that in terms of the resources you need, both in terms of the time it takes to spool up and the memory you need to have a second virtual machine on your laptop and all that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. Can you give any sort of I personally, I'm quite happy working. I know there's a disparity, but I'm willing to live with that because I've only got 4 gig of RAM on my laptop and I haven't got space to launch up a virtual machine.
Yep.
Can you give any guidelines as to what you see as how much memory and how much time does it actually cost to get the environment you're talking about?
Well, I'm running a fairly small application at this stage because it hasn't really grown. And so I'm on this laptop, 4 gig, running a Vagrant box with half a gig of memory, and I'm giving everything less threads and processors, and it's doing just fine. That said, if your database is big, then you might have some fun there. I also tend to have a long-running development environment. I don't tend to destroy and fire up that thing every time. It's kind of living there. And I guess to shortcut the answer, you could get away with your approach and just do in staging that more isolated environment just to prove that you're not going to have any surprises. I've found that there's sometimes some little benefits, just like how you virtualize your Python environment. Virtualizing some of the operating system aspects out as well means that you don't have to upgrade your laptop on your server's schedule or vice versa.
Cool. This isn't actually a question for you because does anybody else have a solution for database migrations when you're not using Django and so therefore can't use South? Come and find me afterwards because I would love to talk to you. And with that, thank you very much, Roger. Here's a cup, coffee and cup.
Thank you kindly.
Thank you very much.